The present exercise is intended to help us to think through the Greek noun cases and their various functions, and to think about the ways in which these case functions are represented in translations at different points along the translation spectrum between the formal equivalent translation, represented by the NRSV here, and the dynamic or functional equivalent translation, represented by the NLT, the New Living Translation here. The NIV, of course, being a self-avowed middle-of-the-road approach that tries to be as formal as possible and as free as necessary, I believe was their motto. The expectation for an exercise like this is not that the student is going to fill in all these blanks correctly the first time through. The case system in Greek is very different from what we're used to in English, as my instructional video on the Greek case system developed at some length in the first 10 minutes or so. But rather, we need to exercise ourselves in thinking about these questions week by week to some extent, so that we can become more practiced in this. The end goal for which I would hope is your ability to simply think about the distance between seeing a noun in a particular case in Greek and seeing the representations of that noun in a particular English translation, and thinking about whether or not that translation really is capturing the most likely case function of the noun, of that noun in that case, in that context, or whether there are other case functions that merit consideration, whether that emerges from a consideration of the different usages in different translations, or a consideration of the secondary resources to which I pointed you and provide you as examples a commentary based on the Greek text, an excerpt from Richard Longenecker's commentary on Galatians in the Word Biblical Commentary, or a more basic grammatical handbook on Galatians, my contribution to the series known as the Baylor Handbooks on the Greek New Testament. So, to begin then with Galatians 5:1, the first word I wanted you all to think about was eleutheria, which, as we find using logos or whatever help will get you there, in the Greek we have simply a noun in the dative case, and we have to ask, what is the dative case signaling in the context of Christ has set us free? So the easy part is filling in the actual case. How is it being used? For freedom is potentially ambiguous as a representation of the dative case. As we see for freedom in English, we might think this is a dative of advantage. I'm not going to type in the case every time, so I'll just say advantage, possibly indirect object, possibly destination. And the same would be true for what we see in the NIV, since exactly the same English words are used for freedom. In essence, I think, and Longenecker puts this forward primarily, and I accept it in my handbook, that the dative of destination is really the best choice here, because freedom is not a separate entity, such that it can be advantaged by the main action, Christ set us free. Instead, it seems to be that new state that is brought about by the main action. that place to which Christ brings us by means of the main action. So, if we really wanted to commit ourselves in translation to rendering this as a dative of destination, we might say, Christ freed us to bring us to a state of freedom. Now that's using a lot of English words, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily adding words, it's merely bringing out the nuance of the dative of destination in a fully committed and unambiguous manner. It's also suggested by some commentators, and I have this in my handbook on this word, that we could think about this as a dative of purpose, which is really not a major category for the dative at all in Greek, although it is better attested in Latin. And if we were to go in that direction, which has some merit to it, we might render it in a committed fashion as Christ set us free in order that we might live in freedom. Again, just making explicit and unambiguous the case function of the dative that we think is being represented here. The NLT actually translate this rather strangely. I do not see any representation here of the word freedom at all. Instead, I see the word truly stuck in. So Christ has set us free truly. And I'm wondering if this represents an understanding of the dative eleutheria as essentially a redundant word for the main verb, so that we might think of it as maybe a locative. In freedom Christ set us free, or something like that, such that it simply becomes emphatic. Christ has truly set us free. I don't think that we need to make a decision on that score. It's enough just to say that the NLT really doesn't represent that word in any clear fashion whatsoever. We might see a little something of this word for freedom, of eleutheria, in the way that the NLT represents stand firm. Notice that, and I didn't expect you all to do this in this exercise per se, we're just talking through everything together now for the sake of hopefully consolidating your thinking. In the way the NLT renders stand firm, which is very fulsome. Now make sure that you stay free, which is essentially the meaning of the simple command here, stay kete, an imperative, stand firm. But what does it mean, stand firm, in this context? It means remain free. And that might suggest that the NLT does in fact regard the word for freedom in 5.1 that it didn't translate up front as the destination of Christ's action of liberation, but has simply transferred that sense, has simply delayed bringing that out to the second half of the verse. Now the next word, oh yes, Christ. The next word that I wanted you to look at was simply Christ, which appears in all three of these, and it is a nominative, and it is represented as the subject of the main verb. Christ has set us free. Christ has, in all of these, Christ has set us free. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's a typical usage of the nominative case, simply the subject of the main verb. Zugo is the next word that I want you to look at. Zugo, over here, is a noun in the dative case, coming from a Greek word meaning a yoke, such as you would put on oxen to pull a cart. And we see it represented in the NRSV as to a yoke, do not submit to a yoke, suggestive, I think, in English at least, of a dative of indirect object. In the NIV, do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke, suggestive of a dative of instrument. What is doing the burdening? What is being used to accomplish the burdening? A yoke. Hence, it is an instrument, the means by which the action happens. So, we might fill this in. Yes, it's a dative. In the NRSV, it looks like it's being used as an indirect object, what we are submitting ourselves to. In the NIV, it looks like it's being used as an instrumental dative, or a dative of means. Before I go on to the NLT, I'm going to look at the next word, douleos, which is a noun in the genitive case. And both the NRSV and the NIV represent the genitive case word douleia as of slavery, which is about the most non-committal way you can render the genitive case in English. Meaning that many of the genitive case usages remain possible for trying to untangle what of slavery really adds here. I think, however, that just reading this as it stands in English, a yoke of slavery, in both the NRSV and NIV would signal a genitive of description. What kind of yoke are we not to submit to? This kind, a yoke of slavery. So, I think descriptive genitive, a genitive of description, would be how each of these is taken. Now, I delayed looking at the NLT because the NLT doesn't use the image of the yoke at all. It just drops the metaphor of yoke because I suppose at the late 20th century, when this translation was created, especially among the more urban readerships who would be attracted to a newer and freer translation, yoke isn't really something one encounters regularly in everyday life unless one is mistaking what is contained within an egg. So the NLT translators dispensed with a metaphor of the yoke and simply represented the thing that the metaphor was pointing to, namely slavery to the law. So we wouldn't really need to fill out that square or anything. We simply need to say, aha, the NLT has done something quite different. Rather than trying to represent the word yoke in the dative case by some conventional means, and the word douleia in the genitive case by some conventional means, they have simply interpreted the metaphor yoke of slavery more fully for their readership. And this is fairly common. The more periphrastic, the more like a paraphrase a translation becomes, the less clarity there is about how they are treating particular words. Nevertheless, I would say this is an excellent translation because this is exactly the advice that Paul is giving. Don't get tied up in slavery to the law is precisely the meaning of don't submit again to a yoke of slavery. So I didn't fill this out, but obviously nominative as subject makes good sense. In regard to the dative, submit yourself to a yoke, the nature of the verb, and I wouldn't expect this simply to fly off the pages at you, but the nature of the verb suggests that this is an indirect object more than it's a dative of means or instrument. And descriptive is probably the best way to take the genitive as well, what kind of yoke. Now I've asked you to skip ahead to Galatians 5, verses 4 and 5. And here, I just asked you to look at one word in Galatians 4, the word behind grace, charitas, which is, as given here, noun in the genitive. And all of the translations represent this with the words from grace. Notice that there is no word from in the Greek. You have fallen, and then there's grace in the genitive. Away from doesn't have a Greek word equivalent. But this is a way of representing in English the sense of a genitive of separation. When you fall away, when you break a relationship, as it were, there's a separation implied. So it makes the most sense to take this as a genitive of separation, as all three translations have clearly done. So, oops, yes, that's correct. A genitive of separation in all three. Then I ask you to look at the words spirit and hope and righteousness in verse 5. Let's just go ahead a little bit here so we can see everything. Spirit in Greek, pneumati, is a noun here in the dative case. Again, notice that there is no Greek equivalent, as it were, for through the in terms of separate words. Through the is a representation of the dative case of pneumati. And I would suggest the NRSV is taking this as a dative of instrument, a dative of means. So we could probably fill this in as instrumental means. And the NIV does exactly the same thing. Another dative of means. Now, the NLT seems to do something different, but I think really all it has done is add some words to make the meaning of the expression through the Spirit clearer. What does through the Spirit mean? It means living by the Spirit. And so it seems to add, in fact it does add, but we who live, or really just who live, because we is already here in the Greek, to make even clearer what through the Spirit means. By the Spirit is another rendering of a dative of instrument or a dative of means. So they all agree, essentially, in regard to how pneumati is used. Separation works there. And I think there's really no reason to dispute that. It makes sense that the Spirit is, in fact, the instrument by means of which we are confidently awaiting the end result of this journey of faith. It is possible to take this dative in other directions. For example, a dative of sphere is also in keeping with Paul's usage of a lot of instances of the dative case of Spirit or of Christ. Being in Christ is a very common Pauline expression. Being in the Spirit is arguably another way to take this dative, by means of living in the Spirit, in the sphere of the Spirit, as opposed to simply living by means of the Spirit's guidance and empowering. Although I'd still throw my money in with the first here. Then elpida dikaiosounes. Well, we have here is a noun in the accusative, elpida, followed immediately by a noun in the genitive. And as you see, the of righteousness in the NRSV is its representation of the genitive case. The word hope is technically the direct object of the verb behind we eagerly wait. In Greek, this is clearer. Elpida is the direct object, the accusative direct object of a Greek verb here. We tend to, or I should put another way, in English, when we use the verb wait, we don't wait something. We wait for something. So the addition of for here is simply idiomatic English because of what is required with the English word await. With the English word wait. If we were to use, as the NIV does, the word await, we could actually have hope as a direct object in English, just as we do in Greek. We await the hope of righteousness. All that to say that English usage aside, this is essentially being read as an accusative of direct object here, and that's frankly the only way to understand it in the Greek. Now, the genitive dikaiosune in the NRSV looks like it's describing hope. We await for the hope of righteousness. What kind of hope are we waiting for? The hope of righteousness. We could, though, even in English, think about this in terms of other major genitive case uses. For example, we could think about this as a genitive of source, the hope that righteousness gives. We could think about it in terms of an objective genitive, the hope, or I should put it another way, with the content of hope, the object of hope being righteousness. So it's fairly ambiguous in the NRSV how we should go with of righteousness, which is in keeping with the NRSV's policy of being as wooden is the typical a word used to describe formal equivalent translation, so as wooden as possible. So it really could be any one of a number of things. I should put question marks. Source, objective genitive. Now, what we encounter in the NIV is perhaps surprising, because rather than waiting for the hope of righteousness, here we see we eagerly await the righteousness for which we hope. Righteousness suddenly has become clearly the direct object of the verb await, rather than merely a description of hope, as in the NRSV. What's happened in the NIV? It has committed to understanding righteousness as an objective genitive, as the object of hope. Whither is your hope directed? For what are you hoping? I am hoping for righteousness. And thus, treating this as an objective genitive, righteousness really emerges as a more important thing, and it's described by this phrase, this relative clause, for which we hope. So, in a sense, we could say, even though it doesn't look like a genitive anymore in the NIV, it has understood dikaiosune as an objective genitive, and it has represented elpida in the best way it could to make this as clear as possible. That is to say, it's not really interested in representing the accusative case of Elpida at all. What it's interested in doing is finding a way to most clearly represent dikaiosune as an objective genitive. And in fact, the exact same thing happens in the NLT. We eagerly wait to receive by faith, we eagerly wait to receive the righteousness God has promised to us. So righteousness again is being shown as the object of our hope, and in this instance, hope is being translated very freely and from a different perspective as what God has promised to us. Nevertheless, what we do find is that the NLT also has made that determination and has not worried really about representing the accusative case of Elpida in any meaningful way. The consensus of the translations, as it were, is in the direction of an objective genitive, and it makes very good sense. I think that's probably the best way to go with this myself. It could be taken in other directions as well. There are commentaries that you could consult that would argue for a genitive of source, the hope that righteousness gives, instead. You might find arguments in favor of a genitive of apposition. We await our hope, namely righteousness. That seems fairly weak, though, basically a restatement of an objective genitive. As we go on in Galatians 5, I ask you to skip ahead to Galatians 5:16. Whoops. There we go. And I ask you to look specifically at the words pneumati, epithumion, and sarkos. Pneumati is in the dative case. And again, we're left to look at how each of these translations is understanding the dative. Live by the Spirit. By and the don't have Greek word equivalents. By is the NRSV and, as it happens, the NIV's choice for representing the dative case and its function. By the Spirit probably is indicating a dative of reference. Walk with respect to the Spirit, with reference to the Spirit. Or perhaps as a dative of instrument. By what means is Paul telling us to walk? We are to conduct ourselves, because walk is metaphorical here. It's not literally putting one foot in front of the other, but conducting our lives by means of the Spirit. We could conceive of it as a dative of rule or a dative of standard. Walk in line with the Spirit, although that really does not seem to be the direction in which either the NRSV or the NIV is going. So it is a dative, and we'd probably have to say means, or like instrument or means, or perhaps dative of reference. And we would say the same for the same words in the NIV. The NLT, again, gives us a very free rendering. Let the Holy Spirit guide your lives. But what it has done here, while again it is not really interested in representing pneumati as any kind of dative in translation, it has clearly understood pneumati as a dative of instrument. And the question then is, who, how shall I put this? Instead of allowing the Spirit to simply remain an instrument or a means, the Spirit now becomes the subject of the verb guide, which isn't in the Greek at all. But still, this seems to be an expression of the Spirit as the active agent in the Christian's walk, directing, showing how to go. So there is some attempt to understand this perhaps as a dative of means, or a dative of even agency is worth considering here, which is very rare for the dative. Usually personal agents don't get represented in the dative case, but in this case, in this instance, the Holy Spirit being a personal being, being a person of sorts, could simply be the agent of our walk. What does it mean to say, let the Spirit be walk by the Spirit's agency? The NLT finds an interpretive way to render that. Right. So kind of means or agency is being represented in this very free rendering. Means does make the most sense. I would suggest possibly dative of rule or standard, walk in line with the Spirit. And I suggest that because Paul is going to say, just 9 verses later in 5:25, walk in line with the Spirit. So this might be already thinking along those lines. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires, or the desire, singular in Greek, of the flesh. Now, epithumia is accusative, and it does appear to be represented simply as the direct object of the verb gratify. You will not gratify X, where X is the direct object. That makes sense. Let's also think, though, about sarkos at the same time. Of the flesh is how both the NRSV and NLT represent this genitive noun, sarkos. Again, of the blank being a formula, a very basic formula for representing the genitive case in English. A very non-committal way of doing so. So how is the genitive of the flesh describing desires? Descriptive? What kind of desires? Fleshly desires? That might be the most natural way to understand this in English. So I will put that down for both. What kind of desires should we not gratify, or will we not gratify if we follow the Spirit? This kind of desire. And all of that needs to go down here. Corrections are awkward in videos. While we're at it, accusative. Direct object in both the NRSV and the NIV. Now what the NLT does is pretty interesting. Then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves. Well, craves obviously comes from the translator's understanding of the word desire, the accusative noun, and your sinful nature is the NLT's rendering of the Greek word flesh. Rather interpretively, what does flesh mean? Well, according to the NLT, it means our sinful nature. Interestingly, the NIV used to translate flesh as sinful nature here, but moved back to flesh because the translators, upon further review, thought sinful nature is just too theologically interpretive. Is Paul actually making a claim about human nature here? Maybe not. So perhaps we shouldn't in our translation. What is interesting about the NLT, though, is it clearly understands sarkos as a subjective genitive. The flesh is desiring. That's how it understands this. What your sinful nature craves, the flesh is doing the desiring. So the NLT, even though in terms of form we don't really see the cases represented in any wooden fashion, we can understand that it has understood sarkos as a subjective genitive, and it's actually I think a very perceptive way to think about this, because flesh and spirit are both operating powers in this paragraph. Paul presents them as acting upon us, dragging us along in one direction or another. So the desires of the flesh might very naturally point to what the flesh wants. And we either go along with it, or we walk by the Spirit and we escape going along with it. I'm not sure we really see too much of the epithumion here, but maybe we do, in that what your sinful nature craves is altogether a direct object of doing. You won't be doing X, where X is not just a simple noun, desire. X is now a whole relative clause, what your sinful nature craves. So I think maybe we could say the NLT has understood this, the epithumion as a direct object, and has represented it even in English as a kind of direct object here. One other possibility to consider for this genitive, I do think subjective really has a lot going for it, but we could also think about it as a genitive of source, the desires that spring from the flesh, as it were. At this point, I invite you to skip ahead to Galatians 5:22, where we have the phrase, the fruit of the Spirit. I ask you simply to look at karpos and pneumatos. The fruit of the Spirit is love, and so forth. Fruit, karpos, is a noun in the nominative case, and it is being represented in both the NRSV and the NIV as the subject of the main verb is. Fruit is love and the rest. Pneumatos, as we look at it here, is a noun in the genitive case. This time Spirit is in the genitive case. And again in the NRSV and the NIV, it is being rendered by of the Spirit in the most non-committal way you can render a genitive, the fruit of the Spirit. So we really don't know, do we, just looking at this English, what the genitival relationship is trying to convey. What kind of relationship Spirit has to fruit. Is it the thing produced, the fruit that is the Spirit? So a genitive of product? Is it a genitive of content, the fruit that contains the Spirit? Is it a subjective? That's the wrong word. Is it a genitive of source, the fruit that comes from the Spirit? Really do not have clear clues, I think, in either the NRSV or the NIV, but the NLT does commit to a very specific understanding of the Spirit as a genitive indicating producer or source. The Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives. And then the list comes. So the NLT abandons the form of the Greek grammar, where the fruit is the nominative subject and of the Spirit is simply a genitive descriptor, and commits to a specific kind of genitive, the genitive producer, and therefore makes the Spirit the apparent subject of the sentence, and fruit the apparent, or I should say kind of fruit, the apparent direct object. So at a formal level, it doesn't correlate closely at all, but grammatically speaking, it has, I think, very accurately, very well given us the meaning of the genitive case pneumatos, understood as a genitive of source or producer. And that makes, again, I think, perfect sense, because the Spirit and the flesh are active forces working upon us and through us, according to Paul. And therefore, the flesh craves one set of things, but the Spirit produces another set of things. So genitive of source or producer really makes good sense here. And the whole point then in Paul's pneumatology, Paul's doctrine of the Spirit, is that Christ died so that we would receive the Spirit. The Spirit is, in fact, the promise that was given to Abraham for Abraham's seed. And the Spirit, in turn, would work all manner of righteousness within us. Hence, what we read in Galatians 5:5. We, through the Spirit, by faith, await the righteousness for which we hope. At this point, we skip to Galatians 5:25, where we have two instances of the word pneumati, which we might recognize already, since we've seen it before, as a dative case, as pneumati, as a spirit, pneuma, in the dative case. I want to see both forms of spirit here at the same time, but I can't seem to make that happen. So we'll be content. Oh yes, if we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit, in the NRSV. In both cases, just a dative, and by the is the way the NRSV, and as it happens, in the first instance, the NIV, represent the dative case of pneuma. Live by the Spirit. Could, even in English, suggest live by the Spirit's agency, if you will, or the standard in line with which we live, as in living by the Golden Rule. Well, the Golden Rule is a standard by which one lives. So we could understand this first instance in either of these two translations as a dative of means, or perhaps a dative of rule. And then in the NLT, we find simply by the Spirit again. So we would probably find the same sense there. Now, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us keep in step with the Spirit, which, by the way, I think is really a good translation of the verb, which you don't have to know about, but I'll just say it. The verb stoichomen, to walk in line with, to fall in line with. Keep step with the Spirit. And in this instance, since step, keeping in step, is clearly a metaphor for marching in a certain rhythm, following a certain leader, then we would probably see with the Spirit here as definitely a dative of rule or a dative of standard. Interestingly, the NLT renders this, let us follow the Spirit's leading in every part of our lives, suggesting probably in the Spirit's leading an understanding of this dative as a dative of agency. So we could, here we go, definitely rule or standard here. Let us be guided by the Spirit, probably dative of agency here, which again is not common because the dative usually deals with instruments, with means, with tools being used to get the main action done. But the Spirit itself, himself, herself, is kind of a strange case in this regard. Some kind of agency. It seems that means could work well with either one, but especially if we think about the root meaning of this verb, we really could go with rule or standard. It does seem from the larger usage of spirit and life or living in Galatians that we would resolve the first use, living, in terms of the Spirit as the instrument by means of which we have come to a new life before God. The second one is less clear. We really could understand this either way. Finally, from this ending segment of Galatians, I asked you to look at the two words nomon and Christou in the verse 6:2, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And let's see, nomon is a noun in the accusative case, and it is in fact represented as a direct object in all three translations. The direct object of fulfill in the first two, the direct object of obey in the NLT. Christ is a genitive noun and is represented with the kind of formulaic representation of the genitive, the of, in all three translations, which is actually very unusual for the NLT also to go with this. The law of Christ. So in all instances, we don't have all that much to go on in terms of direction from any of these translations. What does law of Christ mean? So I suggest in my handbook that we might think about this as a genitive of source. The law that comes from Christ, the law that Christ gave. I think Longenecker also regards it in this way because he explains the law of Christ in parallel with the law of Moses. And the genitive of Moses is clearly disambiguated in the sense, in the direction of source, Moses the lawgiver. The law of Moses, the law that Moses gave. So the law of Christ, the law that Christ gave. It is possible to take this in other directions as well. For example, one could understand this as the genitive of definition. The law as Christ defines it, or even the law whose contours are Christ. That is to say, Christ's example. Not just his teaching, but Christ's example itself has become the new norm that will be fulfilled as we bear one another's burdens. Source still seems to me the more likely, especially because of the typical parallel with nomos Mouseos, the law of Moses, but don't want to rule out the possibility of some of these other senses of the genitive that also makes sense given the role of Christ as example, Christ as paradigm, Christ as norm to be embodied in Paul's ethics. We now skip ahead to Galatians 6:12, where I ask you to look at just two words, stauro and Christou. Stauro is the word for cross in the dative case, followed immediately by the word for Christ, Christou, in the genitive case. For is the word chosen by both the NRSV and the NIV to represent the dative case function of the cross here. And of is the word chosen by the NRSV and, as it happens, also the NIV and the NLT to represent the genitive case function of the word Christ. So, what kind of dative here? Only that they do this in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ, to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. In each of these instances, even though both use the word for, I think we would intuit that for the cross is giving us the cause of persecution, rather than the cross being the indirect object of persecution, or the entity that is advantaged by the persecution. That is to say, I don't think we would understand this intuitively as a dative of indirect object being represented, or as a dative of advantage being represented, or for that matter, a dative of destination. So I would probably think that even these two translations are representing the dative case here as dative of cause, which is not common by any stretch, but does happen. And the genitive case noun, well, that's interesting. Cross of Christ, Christ's cross. You almost have to go with possessive with that one. Not necessarily the cross that Christ owned per se, but the cross that was uniquely Christ's, the one on which he was crucified. So essentially, I think possessive is what we find in all three. Now, the NLT does something a little bit weird, as is its norm. They don't want to be persecuted for teaching that the cross of Christ alone can save. Now, obviously, what the NLT translators are trying to do is to draw out more fully what for the cross of Christ means and how it leads to persecution for the Jewish Christian teachers who proclaim Jesus as the Messiah. So we probably would still understand the NLT understanding the cross here as a dative of cause, persecuted for the cross. It just expands this, limits it really, to their teaching that the cross of Christ alone can save, which we don't have to get into here because this is not a course on Galatians per se, but that may be an overreach on the part of the NLT translators. We'll just leave it at that. But it does look like we still find cause there. And indeed, it does make the most sense to me also to regard this as a dative of cause, possibly the more common dative of reference or respect. They don't want to be persecuted with respect to the cross. They don't want to be persecuted with reference to the cross. Although even there, the cross still really emerges as the reason for the persecution. So maybe I should ditch that as even an option in my handbook. And possession really does seem to be, even though it's not technically possession like Christ owned the cross, but it's that unique relationship, Christ's cross as opposed to any other crucified victim's cross. And then I ask you to skip to Galatians 6:14, where I ask you to look at the usage of three dative case nouns. That's not accurate either. I must be getting tired. 2 nouns in the dative case and 1 in the nominative case. Emoi, which I grant is a pronoun, not a noun, but they really work the same way, is a dative word. And then I ask you to look at world, cosmos, which is a noun in the nominative case, and the second appearance of world, which is then in the dative case. To deal with the simplest first, the nominative case world, by which the world has been crucified. The world has been crucified. In both of these instances, the word world is being given as the subject of a verb, has been crucified, as is appropriate for a nominative case. Now, as to the datives that I asked you to look at. May I never boast of anything. This is a strange use of the dative. I'll just cut to the chase, namely my handbook description of it as a dative of possession. Here, may boasting never be mine is essentially how this plays out in Greek. May it not be for me to boast. May it not be to me to boast. So we could construe it in some other ways, but the way that makes the most sense to me is a dative of possession. May boasting not be mine. And all three translations, rather than using what would in English be an awkward expression, may boasting not be mine, simply transfer this so that I am now the subject of boasting. May I never boast. In this regard, none of them really translated clearly as a dative of anything. And yet they all essentially have represented the meaning beautifully. May boasting not be mine is the same, in effect, as to say, may I never boast. But I'm not going to try to find any particular label here, because it would be false, whatever I could come up with. By which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. The second world here, cosmo, is also a noun in the dative case. Yes, we already put that. I to the world in both the NRSV and the NIV. I have been crucified to the world. That looks like a dative of reference, a dative of respect. I have been crucified with respect to the world, with reference to the world. And that probably is the best way to take it, a dative of reference. It is possible, just given the nature of the verb, crucify, that we could construe it as a dative of disadvantage. The second usage of the dative is a dative of interest, which could be, in fact, I'll just use that larger category, which could be advantage or disadvantage. I did something to someone's or for someone's interest, or I did something against someone's interest. Here, the world has been crucified against my interest in it, and I have been crucified to the world's interest in me, so that we no longer relate to or benefit from one another. This, in fact, is the way that the NLT has translated, has represented the dative case of cosmo, and also the related one, emoi, here. The world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. Both of those are parallel dative expressions. The NLT has translated rather committedly as dative of interest. My interest in this world has been crucified, and the world's interest in me has also died. The translators have changed the syntax quite a bit to make it natural English, but that seems to be the way they have committed themselves, whereas the NRSV and NIV try to remain more open, try to be less limiting in how they are rendering the dative case. So, just to finish the chart, as it were, again, I would find it difficult and artificial, really, to choose between these two. Each one makes very good sense, and Paul doesn't really give us enough to make a choice between them. Hopefully, this review has given you a chance to think through the senses of cases, the functions of cases, and how to think about, again, the distance between just being presented with a Greek noun in a particular case and thinking about the varieties of ways in which that noun has been represented in English translation and negotiating that difference. Of course, this is not something to master in a week. It's something to keep returning to and thinking about. But in the long run, this is one of those areas in which thinking about the original Greek bears the most exegetical fruit, which is why it is one of those facets of Greek grammar that I am focusing us in on in this brief 5-week tour of some of the more salient features of Greek grammar for those who aren't going to learn Greek, but are interested in delving into what Scripture actually says beyond any one translation's representation of the same.